Imagine it's 15th October 1923. You're a 42-year-old professor living in Dresden, Germany. Your name is Victor Klemperer. Your apartment is modest but orderly, with books stacked against the wall and unpaid bills folded inside a desk drawer. Your salary still arrives on paper in thick bundles of marks that look heavy enough to matter. Each morning you ride into town, past bakery windows, and calculate whether your pay will still buy bread by the time your lectures are done. At night, you sit under a weak lamp, open your diary, and ask the same question millions of Germans are now asking. How long will there still be something to eat? If you have ever wondered why governments can create money but never create prosperity, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before, and it keeps leaving the same wreckage behind. If you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. By the time Klemperer wrote that question, the dollar was already racing upward in Germany with the speed of a falling elevator. In January 1923, one US dollar bought about 7,000 marks. By July, it bought 160,000. In August, it bought 1 million. On November 16th, it bought 4.2 trillion. The floor did not vanish all at once. It gave way plank by plank. Then it gave way all at once under the weight of promises the state could no longer keep. People rushed to spend wages the moment they were paid. A pound of potatoes that cost 50,000 marks one day cost $100,000 the next. Bread rose into the billions. Letters cost millions to mail. Families carried cash in knapsacks because pockets were no longer enough. And yet this story is not really about Germany alone. It is about something far larger and far more unsettling. History shows that when a government spends far beyond what it can tax or honestly borrow, and then fills the gap by creating new money, the first effect can look almost harmless. Bills get paid, salaries keep going out, the system seems to breathe for one more day. But beneath the surface, the beams are already rotting. The money itself begins to change. It stops being a store of value, which means a safe place to keep your work for later and becomes a melting ice cube in your hand. That is what this video is about. Not slogans, not internet arguments, not fear, just the historical record. We are going to look at what ordinary people lived through in Weimar Germany, in Zimbabwe, and in Venezuela. We will look at other collapses that rhyme with them. We are going to look at why the mechanism is so consistent, why the middle class so often gets crushed, why a few people come through in one piece, and why printing money ends the same way. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Printing money does not mean prosperity appears out of thin air, any more than printing concert tickets creates more seats in a stadium. Money is a claim. It is a set of tickets that lets people bid for real things like bread, fuel, rent, steel, medicine, and labor. If the number of tickets rises much faster than the amount of real stuff, each ticket buys less. That is inflation. If the process spins out of control so fast that prices rise by the week, day, or hour, that is hyperinflation, which means money is losing value faster than people can safely hold it. But the deeper problem is not just arithmetic, it is trust. An economy runs on shared belief about tomorrow. When people trust the currency, they're willing to work today. They save part of their pay, sign contracts, lend, borrow, and plan. When that trust breaks, the currency becomes like a bridge of wet cardboard. It may still look like a bridge from a distance, but no one wants to be standing on it when the crowd arrives. So people run. They spend money as soon as they get it. They demand higher wages. They raise prices early. They do this because they expect replacement stock to cost more. Businesses stop quoting long-term prices. Banks stop being safe vaults and become traps. The speed of spending rises, and that speed becomes fuel on the fire. Now the problem is no longer just too much money. It is money no one wants to hold. This is the secret key that unlocks every case we are about to examine. In almost every great inflation, the state creates too many claims. The state creates more claims than the economy can honor. Then production gets weaker, not stronger. Then trust collapses. And once trust goes, the currency falls not like a leaf, but like a piano. The first great warning came in Germany. The seeds were planted years before the peak. During the war, the German government chose borrowing and money creation over taxation. That decision mattered. It meant the country tried to fight an industrial war without fully paying for it in the present. The bill was pushed into the future like trash swept under a rug. After the war ended, that hidden pile was still there. Germany owed huge domestic war debts. It also faced reparations, which were payments imposed by the victorious Allies. Its budget was badly out of balance. The government needed money it did not have, and instead of closing the gap, it leaned on the press. Then came the Ruhr crisis in 1923. When Germany fell behind on reparations, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr. The German government encouraged passive resistance, which meant workers went on strike rather than cooperate. The state promised support. But supporting striking workers while factories stood still meant paying out money while producing fewer goods. It was like adding more water to a soup pot while taking vegetables out of it. More marks, fewer things to buy. Ordinary people felt the breakdown first, not in statistics, but in timing. Time itself changed. Paydays became races. Sebastian Haffner later recalled that savings vanished whether they were tiny or vast. George Gross described having to buy quickly. A rabbit might cost 2 million marks more by the time you walked into the shop. Victor Klemperer wrote that the dollar stood at 800 million. It rose another 300 million a day. Maximilian Bern, a retired Berliner, withdrew 100,000 marks and found it could barely buy a subway ticket. He reportedly spent it on one last ride around the city, then went home to starve. That is what inflation at this scale really does. It does not just raise prices, it deletes stored time. Years of work evaporate. Damage was hard to measure because measuring sticks were burned. Facing history notes that by 1924, prices had reached roughly 1 billion times their pre-war level. On November 15th, 1923, the Rentenmark was introduced to stop the spiral. But stopping the spiral did not restore what was destroyed. Pensioners were ruined. Bank savers were ruined. The middle class was hit like glass under a hammer. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Not everyone lost in the same way. Borrowers often did better than savers. Debts could be repaid in money that had become nearly worthless. Industrial firms with export earnings sometimes did better. People with access to foreign currency early in the crisis could live far better than neighbors paid only in marks. Rural families with food to barter stood in a stronger position than urban families with paper claims and empty cupboards. Inflation was not a storm that soaked everyone evenly. It was more like acid rain. Some materials dissolved at once, others held up longer. The damage depended on what you were made of. And this brings us directly to the next question. If a society can clearly see prices exploding, why does it not simply stop the process sooner? Is money accepted because the law says it is money, or because people still believe someone else will value it tomorrow? Drop your answer in the comments, seriously. Because what comes next is the part many think could never happen today. Zimbabwe shows that it can. By the late 1990s and 2000s, the economy was weakened by mismanagement and war spending. Land seizures damaged agricultural output, and a state kept promising more than it could honestly finance. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe became the government's money machine. That phrase is not rhetorical. The IMF describes the core problem plainly. The government spent, and the central bank financed that spending by creating money. Once that habit took hold, the currency's credibility rotted from the inside. This was not simply greedy shopkeepers. The deeper reality was that the state was issuing more claims while the country's real productive base was shrinking. Farms that had once produced export crops faltered. Foreign exchange dried up. Scarcity grew. So the government printed still more. To cover salaries, subsidies, and obligations, it was a dog chasing its tail around a bonfire. The numbers were extreme. The official year-over-year inflation figure cited by Cato for February 2008 was 165,000%. By early June 2008, unofficial estimates put it around 2.5 million% a year. Monthly rates reached 79.6 billion%. The Zimbabwe dollar lost more than 99.9% of its value. Cumulative inflation was nearly 3.8 billion%. When you hear numbers like that, normal language begins to fail. In hyperinflation, the percentage becomes a gravestone. Daily life looked like wages that were dead on arrival. Shop shelves were stripped bare because no merchant wanted to sell for cash. Workers sprinted to spend cash before sunset. Banknotes with so many zeros became a joke before the ink was dry. Zimbabwe eventually printed a $100 trillion note. Not 100,000, not 100 million, 100 trillion. The printing press had become a photocopier for disbelief. Ordinary people used US dollars and barter to survive. Unofficial money starts growing in the cracks of the official system the way weeds grow through broken pavement. By 2009, Zimbabwe effectively abandoned its local currency and allowed foreign currencies to circulate. That ended the hyperinflation. The people most exposed were those trapped on fixed incomes like pensioners, civil servants, and small savers. Anyone whose earnings stayed in local currency lost. People in better shape had access to outside currency or tradable goods. Printing money did not create wealth. It transferred pain. Venezuela's economic skeleton looks painfully familiar. A government dependent on oil revenue lost income after 2014. It kept trying to preserve subsidies and state obligations. Price and currency controls made importing harder. Shortages deepened, output weakened. Expanding the money supply grew stronger. The St. Louis Fed notes that countries undergoing hyperinflation often carry high debt and print money to meet those debts. Value falls. Credibility is lost. People demand higher wages. That spiral is a recurring plotline in economic history. In Venezuela, the IMF projected inflation could hit 1,000%. Opposition estimates reached 46,305% in early 2018. When a government stops publishing the numbers, That is a sign the thermometer itself has become politically dangerous. Reuters described a country where gradual dollarization widened inequality. Public employees were stuck with tiny wages. A nurse could not change her oil. A retired teacher could not buy cheese. A pensioner sold candy in the subway to survive. It is a society splitting into two price systems. One class lives in hard currency, the other in the ghost of a currency. One can plan, the other cannot. Dollarization in Venezuela was a survival instinct, a reach for a measuring stick that did not bend. Governments ran fiscal holes and bridged them with money creation while the real economy was weakened. Then trust snapped. Speed mattered more than price. People rushed out of the currency. Savers were punished. Debtors did relatively better. Stabilization came only when the state stopped pretending paper alone could replace production and credibility. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. Hyperinflation happens when the unit of account itself starts to die. The yardstick for prices shrinks while you measure with it. Contracts, accounting, and planning all break down. Governments blame hoarding and speculators, but the rot is in the beams. The currency eventually tells the truth. Politicians will not. The people hit hardest are the savers and pensioners. Monetary collapse is deeply unfair. It punishes caution and rewards speed. In Argentina, inflation reached 2,600%. The banking system practically disappeared. A banking system is a vault for memory. In high inflation, that vault turns to smoke. Argentines adapted by watching the dollar because the local unit could not be trusted. Lebanon followed a familiar road. After unsustainable policies, capital inflows stopped in 2019 and the exchange rate system cracked. Banks froze dollar accounts. The pound lost 95% of its value. A soldier's monthly wage fell to less than $50. Grocery stores demanded dollars. Pricing in pounds was like writing prices on water. Families held up banks to demand their own money. A currency crisis drains hospitals and power grids. The middle class lives by rules that no longer exist. Identity shock follows. A professional salary becomes bus fare. Monetary collapse feels less like a recession and more like a social landslide. History shows survivors shared three traits. First, they understood early that local currency was no longer a safe warehouse for labor. They understood cash was rotting. Second, they held something with value outside the broken note, like land, food, or export income. Third, they were flexible. They stopped treating paper promises like granite. They realized the old script was gone. Money printing can make things look better in the early phase. Debtors feel relief and asset prices rise in local currency. But it only moves the damage forward in time. Paper claims cannot replace real production and real trust. The bridge becomes the collapse. This is the lesson from Berlin, Harare, Caracas, Buenos Aires, and Beirut.